Factories on trains. On June 22, 1941, the Soviet Union was attacked by the Army of the Third Reich. Hundreds of trains, loaded with machines and workers, made their way east, far from the fighting. The Nazi invasion, Operation Barbarossa, relied on surprise and speed, what the Germans called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The Red Army was crushed. Ukraine and Belarus, the wealthiest industrial and agricultural states in the USSR, were under threat from German troops. Most of the USSR's economy lay in the western part of the country. The Soviet Union was fighting for its survival. How could it hope to keep fighting when the plants that made artillery, tanks, and munitions risked falling into enemy hands? Stalin took a bold and radical decision: to dismantle, evacuate, and reinstall his war industries away from the front, to stop them from falling into Nazi hands. It was both an amazing feat and a mystery. How, in a matter of months, were they able to uproot and move weapons manufacturers, steelworks, and stocks of raw materials? How was the Soviet war economy able to reorganize and rebuild itself to finally produce more arms than Germany? It was the Soviet people who would save the country. The soldiers at the front, of course, but also the workers behind the lines. Laborers, engineers, technicians, men and women fled eastwards with their factories. An army of simple people who, far from the front, would fight inside the factories to win the war for their homeland. The German offensive caught Stalin by surprise, but he refused to lose his cool. On the day after the first assault, June 23rd, he decided to move critical industries to safety. No leader or country had ever shifted its entire economy overnight. But it was a matter of rescuing the main components of the future war effort: steelworks, ironworks, tank and aircraft assembly lines, munitions plants, power stations, uniform makers, along with stocks of coal, minerals, and grain. Beneath the batteries from the German army, the Soviets had to find trains and trucks, dismantle the plants, and transport the workers. The people of the USSR were forced to improvise. The Germans advanced hour by hour. The economic heartland of the Soviet Union would soon be occupied and destroyed. Irreparable damage. The Baltic states, Belarus, and Ukraine accounted for a third of Soviet industrial production, half of farm produce, and 2/3 of steel production. The first plant to be moved, from Mariupol in Ukraine, produced steel plating to armor tanks. The decision was taken on June 24th, 2 days after the German invasion. They also had to find new locations for the plants. A delegation from the tank factory in the vast Kirov complex was sent from Leningrad to the Urals to look for a site where its workshops would be sheltered. Once again, Moscow hoped that the immensity of its territory would be able to absorb the violence of the enemy attack.
Well, for the Soviet people, the Barbarossa invasion was also a shock. I mean, they didn't know how to react. They didn't know what to expect. They were told everywhere that the fascist invader had finally arrived and so on, and they would have to do something. But when Stalin gave his speech on the radio on July the 3rd, it was a call to the Soviet people. Now you have to stand together. You have to repel the fascist invader. Brothers and sisters, he called them. Almost the only time that Stalin actually addressed his people in familiar terms. And people listened everywhere to this speech. It made them realize that this was a fight they would have to engage in and that they would all be involved.
The Nazi project was predatory and colonial. On crossing the border, Hitler wanted to plunder everything that was missing in Germany. Raw materials for the Reich's industries, wheat for the people's bread, and land for German settlers. It also laid out the annihilation of the populations of Ukraine and Belarus. Jews would be exterminated and Slavs doomed to slavery or famine. Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, Kharkiv. Within 3 months, the Germans had captured the main economic hubs. Whenever Nazi troops approached a city, the factories shut down. Industrial giants crucial to the Soviet war effort moved out. Steelworks and aircraft, tank, and artillery plants were dismantled. They went on producing until the last instant. Then the machines were loaded onto trains. For a large plant, up to 10,000 freight wagons were needed, spread over several hundred rail convoys. The workers often left on the same trains.
It overloaded the transport system, which was also needed to supply troops at the front. And then there was the question of the evacuation of Kiev. How long could they leave the plants in Kiev to contribute to the war effort and the defense of the city? And when should they move the plants in order to save national production? And it was these very small decisions, sometimes to the nearest day, which would determine the success of the operation.
In charge of evacuating the plants was Lazar Kaganovich, the People's Commissar for Transport. He wrote in his memoirs,
"There was utter panic, as there was no mobilization plan. And the calendar didn't provide for more transport, which would be needed for such a massive evacuation in such a short space of time. In July 1941, we had already mobilized 300,000 freight cars.
You can imagine the starting point, which is the moment when the factory director says, stop production, start the dismantling. And, the sound of gunfire is already in the air at this point. And then let's assume the existence of a train and wagons and the workers start to put the machinery on wheels.
For the USSR, it was a war of time and space. Its outcome would be played out on the front, in the blood and fury of combat, but also on the railroads. The evacuated plants would find refuge in the south, east, and north, deep within the Soviet Empire. 22 million square kilometers, by far the world's largest country.
Orders go out, people scramble around, ordering trains, lorries and so on to load everything on, move it away, dump it somewhere in Kazakhstan or Siberia. It was, a procedure that the Soviets were not expecting to perform. And the fact that they actually did it, I think, was quite remarkable.
Several things could happen along the way. One is trains got mixed up, or they got misrouted, or they got lost, because there was no schedule for this. Something else could happen, which is that some local commissar who sees the approaching front line thinks, there's this train stopped in the siding with fuel, with machinery that we could use. Nobody's in charge, but we need it now. So they raided these trains. Stuff was appropriated.
The moving of the plants was a disorderly retreat which relied on the Soviet talent for resourcefulness and improvisation. A huge mess which Stalin's propaganda machine failed to mention. The USSR was invincible. The Soviet hero would die at the front and would never retreat. Among all the propaganda that Soviet power fed its people, only the fictional movie Simple People told the story of the industrial evacuation. The screenplay was written in 1943 and the movie shot in 1944. It tells of the experience of millions of Soviets who were transferred to the Urals or Siberia with their machines. It features Comrade Yeremin, the director of the Chekalov aircraft manufacturing plant in Leningrad. Yeremin delivers one last fighter plane, which immediately flies off to the front. Then he moves his plant to Central Asia. There, he reconstructs his workshops and relaunches aircraft production.
Все. Принимайте последнюю машину завода имени Чкалова. Извините, что без испытаний. Испытывать будем там. Спасибо, товарищ директор. Спасибо, товарищи. Надолго запомни этот день.
Saving the plants was just the first step. The entire economy needed reorganizing. Nikolai Voznesensky, Stalin's favorite economist, was in charge of the remobilization of industry. Voznesensky was the head of Gosplan, the agency responsible for the USSR's economic planning. He summoned engineers and technicians to the Kremlin. Metallurgy engineer Sergei Emelianov attended one of the meetings and described it in his diary.
When I reached the Kremlin, the meeting had already begun. Voznesensky started speaking. From now on, nickel is reserved for armor plating and steel for artillery. We need 30,000 tons of nickel. Where can we find it? You're all experts and communists. Tell me what I have to do.
At the heart of this monolithic and centralized system, Chief Economic Planner Voznesensky asked what he should do. He spoke directly to engineers, bypassing the numerous layers of bureaucracy. Importance had shifted. This was a time of emergency. Voznesensky focused the entire Soviet economy on a single aim: the war.
you can imagine a powerful river that suddenly took two courses. And one course was the course of mobilization. So immediately, hundreds of thousands of young men were called up and taken into the armed forces, many of them from the countryside, from agriculture. And at the same time, the leaders knew that they had to immediately ramp up the production of weapons. And so all around the country you get civilian enterprises stopping making sewing machines and bicycles and so on and converting to various branches of war production. And so on one side you get the immediate increase in the size of the armed forces and a surge of war production. And then on the other side you find other branches of the economy that simply dropped away.
Вам пакет радиограммы из Москвы.
Orders rain down from above. Like thousands of plant directors, engineers, and workers, Yarraman would need to rely on resourcefulness to work miracles.
Самолеты нужны как хлеб, как воздух. Крайний срок выпуска 2 месяца.
Simple people lived up to its title. The film doesn't show high-ranking party dignitaries,
Пошли.
model workers, or heroic soldiers. It tells us that the displacing of industry depended on the people, their capacity to survive, and their talents for improvisation. By late July 1941, in less than a month, German troops had advanced 300 kilometers inside the Soviet border. The front now stretched from the Baltic states in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The evacuation's race against time continued beneath the shells of the German artillery and the bombs of the Luftwaffe.
Finally, you get to a railhead somewhere in the remote interior, and then you have a greenfield site. It's a site that lacks worker accommodation. It doesn't have electric power. There might not be enough workers. The workers might have peeled off on the way. Somebody might have conscripted them for some other project. So it's kind of greenfield industrialization has to take place.
Я протестовал, спорил, требовал, но ничего не сделаешь.
Ну что ж, начнем размещать цеха.
Дмитрий Павлович.
А что сделано для встречи эшелонов?
Пока вопрос не решен.
Сейчас он решен. Свяжитесь с городом, выясните наличие транспорта, помещений. Нет, вы не записываете, а, как называется, идите и выясните. Денис Петрович, а вы займитесь осмотром площадки.
On the ground, the evacuation became a massive headache. Each plant had its own story. In late August 1941, the production lines at the Kirov tank factory in Leningrad finally found a new home. They were transferred to Nizhny Tagil, 500 kilometers away. In September 1941, the front reached dangerously close to the precious locomotives plant in Kharkiv. The only site capable of receiving it was Nizhny Tagil. The Kirov tank factory had to move again, this time to Chelyabinsk, where it merged with a tractor factory to continue manufacturing tanks. The fall rains began on October 8th. The roads became treacherous. In early November, the Germans closed in on Moscow. 500 companies left the city, and with them, almost half of its 4.5 million inhabitants. On December 5th, German troops came to a halt a few kilometers from the Kremlin. Winter set in. As 1941 came to an end, the USSR had not collapsed. The Red Army counted its dead in hundreds of thousands. The renowned Russian poetess Anna Akhmatova wrote,
"Life is for others, not for you. Cold in the snow you lie. Bayonets made 28 wounds, bullets, another fire. A garment of new grief I made. I sewed it for my love. O Russian earth, it loves the taste. It loves the taste of blood."
After 6 months of blitzkrieg, the toll on human life was terrifying. The economic toll, too. Hitler's troops controlled the regions that produced half of the USSR's steel and half of its farm produce. Heady with the sweeping success of their blitzkrieg, the Nazis failed to notice that the Soviets had opened another front. 220 plants had been reinstalled in the Caucasus, 660 in the Urals, 240 in Western Siberia, 80 in Eastern Siberia, and 300 in Kazakhstan and Central Asia. The Soviets had managed to relocate more than 1,500 plants, equivalent to 13% of the country's entire industrial production. On some shop floors, production had already started up again. The Red Army began receiving the tanks, aircraft, and heavy artillery it required.
The graph of war production during the war is very impressive. It's a bit like, Table Mountain in South Africa. It just goes up to a plateau and then stays there for most of the rest of the war. But in the winter of 1941, that ascent hesitates. And it's hesitating partly because all the other branches of the economy are falling away, and partly because a lot of the capacity of the economy that was in the western regions, if it's not being captured, it's on railway trucks.
The Soviet Union owed the rescuing of its war factories to the courage of its people. Alexander Worth, one of the few Western journalists present in the USSR in 1941, was an eyewitness.
I had the opportunity of talking to many workers, both men and women, who had been evacuated to the Urals or Siberia during the grim autumn or early winter months of 1941. The story of how whole industries and millions of people had been moved to the east, of how industries were set up in a minimum of time, in appallingly difficult conditions. and of how these industries managed to increase production to an enormous extent was, above all, a story of incredible human endurance. In most places, living conditions were fearful. In many places, food was very short too. People worked because they knew that it was absolutely necessary. They worked 12, 13, sometimes 14 or 15 hours a day. They lived on their nerves. They knew that never was their work more urgently needed than now. Many died in the process.
The Soviets were coming out of a terrible decade with lots of fear, deportations, executions, and purges in the party and in the economic apparatus. So they were used to surviving. But at least war has the advantage of you knowing what you're surviving. It's not the state attacking its own people, but a foreign power, a foreign army, bringing blood and thunder onto Soviet territory.
Basically, for civilians, the war was merely an extension of a society and economy that had been living in wartime conditions throughout the 1930s. That explains, one, their endurance, but also their lack of protest and their familiarity with all of the hardships they had suffered during the decade before the war.
In the late 1920s, Stalin imposed a series of 5-year plans to industrialize the Soviet Union. Within a few years, industrial giants sprang up like mushrooms in Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, and Dnipropetrovsk. The Stalinist economy was planned and centralized. Its implementation was violent and brutal. The plans didn't forecast. They were primarily instruments of mobilization and constraint. Across the country, they imposed outsized targets. In every workshop, factory, office, kolkhoz, street and store, workspace was invaded by injunctions. You must do better. You must outdo the goals of the plan. Stalin wanted to create a new society, an army of workers who in factories and fields were obliged to produce always more and around the clock.
Родина большая, ненаглядная моя, трудовая, боевая, необъятная семья. Родина большая.
What characterized the political and economical life of the 1930s was the omnipresence of war. Not only war in its classic sense of military conflict, the entire mobilization of Soviet society was a warlike mobilization. They spoke of the labor front, soldiers of industrialization. When a worker left his post without authorization, it was called desertion of work.
The USSR was a bastion of socialism, besieged by a hostile environment, seen as an enemy. And so all economic development was primarily a development of military power, so that it was respected on a military level. The two were intrinsically linked.
The regime's parades exalted war and industry. In the 1930s, Soviet society was already mobilized against capitalism and imperialism from the outside, and against the enemies of the regime on the inside. And the powers were at war with the people who needed transforming and purging. Agricultural land was collectivized in 1929. Farmers were obliged to give their harvest to the state to feed the new population of workers who were toiling away, by will or by force, in Soviet factories. Collectivization and industrialization killed millions of people and profoundly reshaped society.
In the 1930s, despite the incredibly difficult living conditions, the large majority of people did believe that a new world was being built, a world called socialism. That doesn't mean that everybody adhered to all of the regime's values, but the notion of a world of progress and new construction was definitely at the core of society's beliefs.
The men and women who lived through the Stalinist 30s had learned the very hardest way. Between June and December of 1941, the Soviet people, now used to enduring the worst and getting by on little, were ready to handle the chaos of industrial evacuation. Protests were rare, but they did exist. At the locomotives plant in Kharkiv, Ukraine, 7,000 out of 12,000 workers refused to leave for the Urals, preferring to stay put. In Ivanovo, a city specialized in the textiles industry, 200 kilometers northeast of Moscow, reports by local officials bear traces of the revolt of simple people.
Report dated November 2nd, 1941, on anti-Soviet disorder in the Ivanovo region. Strictly confidential. In the weaving workshop, groups of workers began to form, shouting, "If you take our machines, we'll be left without work. All the managers have left the city and have abandoned us. We will not let you dismantle our machines." Worker Kulikova stated, "Hitler isn't stealing our bread. Our managers are sending it to him. Our managers have stopped giving us bread. Are they keeping it for themselves?" Worker Lebovo stated, "We're hungry. We cannot work anymore."
Expressing anger or resentment was risky business in a world fueled by heroics and enthusiasm. Trouble was rare and didn't last long. But a large part of the population was dismayed, shocked by the repeated defeats of the Red Army, lost in the incredible confusion that reigned across the entire country. The propaganda machine had its work cut out in trying to quell doubts and to convince the Soviet people to mobilize at the front and at the rear.
Alors la propagande se dote
Propaganda was equipped with all kinds of tools. The press,
des arts plastiques,
art,
qu'il s'agisse de la littérature,
literature,
qu'il s'agisse
posters,
des affiches,
and of course
et puis,
film.
bien sûr, du cinéma. Et dans ce système de
And
propagande,
in the propaganda
le
machine,
cinéma occupe une
film was
place
given a privileged
absolument
place
à part
right
et
from
une
the
place
beginning.
privilégiée, depuis le début.
The film industry was made a priority. Movies continued to be shown at the front and behind the lines.
Le cinéma n'est pas seulement un
The
loisir.
movies were more than entertainment in the Soviet Union. They were an indispensable weapon. Very early on, in the summer of 1941, filmmakers received their first injunctions. They were required to make films to mobilize the population, and also, very quickly, later that year, to highlight the crimes of the enemy.
Краснознаменный ансамбль песни и пляски под управлением профессора Александра.
Герой фашистской нечисти, загоним пулю в лоб. Над кровью человечества сколотим крепкий гроб. Пусть ярость благородная стихает от холма, идет война народная, священная война.
Movie studios left Moscow and Leningrad and were evacuated, just like the factories. The director, Sergei Eisenstein, his actors and technicians, found themselves in Alma-Ata, the capital of Kazakhstan, in makeshift studios hastily put together by Mosfilm for the shoot of the second half of Ivan the Terrible.
Avec Ivan Terrible,
in Ivan the Terrible, they sought a figure from the distant past who had been decried throughout the early part of the history of the Soviet Union. They sought this figure because he had nonetheless united Russia, and this was very important, around Moscow. He was a military figure, a victor in battle, and he stood up to the West, which was a foundation of the Soviet patriotism that emerged during World War II.
Rather than talk of the war in Marxist terms, Stalin had a stroke of political genius. In his great speech of July the 3rd, 1941, to liken this war to the long line of great patriotic victories won by eternal Russia over all invaders.
The powers that be had changed their tune. The people were no longer fighting for the future of communism, but for the survival of the homeland and Holy Russia. In the Soviet Union, World War II became known as the Great Patriotic War. Propaganda's conjuring trick had worked. Whether it was for the USSR, for Holy Russia, or the motherland, the Soviet people would fight. And their resistance was extraordinary. In late 1941, the country was in chaos. But that didn't stop Stalin from launching the construction of a north-south railroad to open up Stalingrad and its surrounds. Compared with the urgency of the Blitzkrieg, another, much longer time frame began. Stalinist time was applied to a vast territory, an empire with distant boundaries and numerous peoples. A stock of space and human lives which allowed the USSR to withstand the German invasion. The Nazis were playing poker. They unfurled their blitzkrieg in search of the decisive moment, the definitive collapse of the enemy. While the Soviets were playing chess, in the face of the speed of the lightning war, they set up their defenses, behind which was progressive and lasting industrial intensification.
Начнем. Я дал приказ начать производство. У нас нет крыш, нет цехов, станки под открытым небом, нет людей. Будет невиданно трудно, и хватит об этом. Слово «трудно» придется забыть. Начнем работать без стен. Стены будем возводить вокруг станков, а люди... Рабочие заводы имени Чкалова.
Это полчища казаков-разбойников? Вы называете рабочими заводы имени Чкалова?
Да, их надо учить. И мы их научим. И вместе с ними дадим самолет через 2 месяца.
In reality, the arrival of the plants was rarely celebrated. In the regions that received them, the inhabitants were recruited by force. They were given the toughest, most dangerous jobs. With little food, they were the first to die. They spoke little Russian and had no training.
The problem with the workforce, of course, is that a great many workers have been mobilized into the armed forces, and many of them lost, of course, with the huge number of prisoners that the Germans seized. You had to have a core of skilled workers to be able to cope with the demands of war production. But a huge proportion of the other workers were women, women who were hastily drafted into war work if necessary, given very short training courses and so on. Or even young people, people of 14, 15, 16 were there in the factories working 10-hour shifts and so on.
Everywhere they worked an average of 9 hours a day, 6 days a week. Work was closely watched and run like in the military. Absenteeism, lateness, and negligence were punished. A decree dated December 26, 1941 foresaw 5 to 8 years in the Gulag for leaving one's post without permission. There was also forced labor, much of it carried out by Gulag prisoners. Political opponents, common law detainees, potato thieves, workers who clumsily let out a joke about Stalin, Catholics, Protestants, and Muslims, the inmates of the Gulag made up an exploitable workforce for the dirtiest, toughest jobs, like extracting raw minerals, coal mining, logging, and construction. And this forced mobilization of labor bore fruit. By will or by force, the Soviets produced. In the mines and the armaments factories, tomorrow's victories were forged in the workshops.